The suburban landscape of Willow Creek was meticulously crafted to project an image of serene conformity. Every lawn was a precise shade of emerald green, every shutter painted a pre-approved neutral hue, and every property line, theoretically, was a sacred, uncrossable boundary. We moved into 142 Sycamore Lane expecting peace, a quiet cul-de-sac existence where neighborhood disputes centered on who hosted the best 4th of July barbecue. We were wrong. Our neighbor, Mr. Alastair Finch, at 144 Sycamore, was a man whose sense of entitlement was as vast and uncompromising as his collection of vintage garden gnomes. He was not merely a neighbor. He was a self-appointed Border Patrol agent of his own perceived domain. The trouble began not with a word, but with a whisper of cement dust and the ominous clang of heavy machinery. Our two properties had always been separated by a modest, chest-high hedge of privet, a leafy, natural divider that respected the recorded boundary markers. One Tuesday morning, a specialized landscaping crew arrived at Mr. Finch's property. They didn't come to trim the hedges. They came to eradicate them. By noon, the privet was gone, leaving a naked, vulnerable strip of earth where green had thrived for decades. I watched, mildly concerned, from my kitchen window as Mr. Finch, dressed in immaculate khaki shorts and a sun visor, consulted with the foreman, his gestures authoritative and sweeping. The true nature of the impending conflict became terrifyingly clear that afternoon when the first survey stakes were hammered into the ground. I had a copy of my official property survey, a document meticulously drawn and filed with the county. The legal line, running straight from the front sidewalk marker to the back corner pin, passed neatly down the center of where the privet hedge had stood. But Mr. Finch's stakes told a vastly different, more aggressive story. They were placed not on the boundary, but a full 3 feet inside my property line, carving a significant, illegal sliver off my backyard. 3 feet might sound negligible, but across the entire length of the yard, it represented a sizable chunk of land. Land that belonged to me, land that was legally defined and paid for. The next day, the foundation began. Not the light work of a decorative garden wall, but a deep trench dug with professional precision, reinforced with rebar and poured with concrete. Mr. Finch was not building a fence. He was building a barrier. I immediately attempted communication. I walked across my lawn, carefully stepping up to his aggressive new stake line. I held my original survey in my hand, ready to engage in a rational, neighborly discussion about a clear and unambiguous error. His response was not rational. It was a calculated, premeditated dismissal. He didn't even turn his body to face me fully. He merely glanced over his shoulder, a look of smug superiority etched across his face. He waved a sheaf of crumpled, hand-drawn diagrams, muttering something vague about new measurements and historical precedent, and my yard just feels right here. He claimed his own survey, which he refused to let me examine, superseded mine because his family had supposedly owned the land longer, a historically irrelevant and legally meaningless argument. He finished his brief, icy monologue by stating, "The wall is going up tomorrow. If you touch my line markers, I will call the police." I retreated, my heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and righteous anger. This wasn't a misunderstanding about a drooping branch or a noisy air conditioner. This was theft, plain and simple, executed with the audacious confidence of a bully who believed they were untouchable. My initial attempts to de-escalate had failed spectacularly. I knew then that the path forward would not be one of polite negotiation, but one of absolute, uncompromising legal and tactical defense. I drove immediately to the county records office and obtained certified, stamped copies of my property deed and plat map. The line was unambiguous. Mr. Finch was building a structure wholly, physically, and illegally on my land. This would not stand. But first, I had to watch him build his monument to arrogance. The foundation was set. The first courses of the wall were about to rise. I needed a plan that was as solid as his newly poured concrete. The game was on, and I had just been given the blueprints to his betrayal. The construction proceeded with a frightening speed and an almost insulting disregard for my clearly stated opposition. Mr. Finch was not merely building a fence. He was erecting a barricade. The structure that rose on my land was not a standard suburban divider. It was tall, easily 8 feet high, constructed of heavy, decorative stone blocks designed to project an image of impregnable, medieval fortress security. It was imposing, expensive, and utterly monstrous. The sun-drenched symmetry of my backyard was suddenly bisected by a towering, granite gray monstrosity that cast a perpetually expanding shadow across my carefully tended flower beds. It felt like living next to a prison yard. I immediately contacted an attorney specializing in property law. The consultation confirmed everything I already knew. The survey was clear, the law was on my side, and Mr. Finch's actions constituted an illegal encroachment, a private nuisance, and a clear act of property theft. The attorney advised the standard legal procedure: send a sharply worded, certified cease and desist letter, backed by the certified survey, demanding the immediate removal of the structure. This was the necessary first step, the legally sanctioned formality. But I knew this wouldn't work with Alastair Finch. I had seen the look in his eyes, the unwavering conviction of a man who believes his financial superiority exempts him from the rules that govern mere mortals. A letter, even from a lawyer, would simply be treated as an irritating bureaucratic hurdle. It would initiate a slow, costly legal battle that could drag on for years, while the Great Wall of Arrogance stood sentinel on my lawn. I simply didn't have the stomach or the bank account for that kind of protracted war of attrition. I needed a strategy that was faster, more surgical, and entirely final. The cease and desist letter was sent nonetheless, for the record. As predicted, Mr. Finch ignored it. The construction crew, presumably instructed to finish quickly before any legal injunction could be processed, worked through the weekend, cementing the final capstones onto the wall. When the last worker packed up, the granite wall stood solid, finished, and defiant, 3 feet inside the legal boundary of 142 Sycamore Lane. It was a tangible expression of Mr. Finch's contempt. I spent the next several days pacing the perimeter of the structure on my side, running my fingers over the rough, cold stone. I felt powerless, violated. I knew that the law would eventually compel him to tear it down, but that process could take 6 months to a year. 6 months of staring at that oppressive wall, 6 months of compromised property value, 6 months of a constant, burning reminder of my neighbor's tyranny. I needed an ending that was quicker and less costly. I needed to leverage his arrogance against him. I went back to the survey, the official plat map, and my deed. I studied the legal definition of the property line, the specific language detailing the boundary markers and the easements. My research became obsessive. I learned the precise legal distinction between an encroachment and a spite fence. I meticulously documented the wall's dimensions, confirming its exact illegal placement to the nearest inch. And then, a crucial detail emerged from the county records regarding Mr. Finch's own property. Mr. Finch had listed his house for sale. A for sale by owner sign, ostentatious and slightly aggressive, had been hammered into his front lawn just weeks before the wall construction began. The wall, I suddenly realized, wasn't just an act of spite. It was an attempt to inflate the perceived size of his backyard, to create a false impression of a larger, more exclusive property for potential buyers. He was sacrificing 3 feet of my property to gain an advantage in his real estate transaction. The listing details I found online confirmed it, boasting a large, recently walled private backyard. This discovery changed everything. The fight was no longer about a few feet of grass. It was about a deceptive, high-value real estate transaction. The clock was now ticking much faster than any court docket. He was clearly expecting a quick sale, likely driven by the premium he felt his new Walden yard would command. My revenge, my surgical strike, needed to align perfectly with the timeline of his sale. I realized I held the ultimate leverage, the power to irrevocably poison the well just before he could drink from it. I wouldn't wait for the judge. I would wait for the closing date. I would allow the lie to solidify before I exposed it. I was going to let him sink a buyer, commit to the sale, and reach the finish line, only to pull the rug out from under him at the very last second. The subsequent weeks were an exercise in controlled patience, a tense period of waiting that felt like counting down the seconds to a high-stakes detonation. Mr. Finch's house, 144 Sycamore, received a flurry of activity. Real estate agents fluttered around, prospective buyers toured the property, and on multiple occasions, I watched Mr. Finch proudly gesture toward the new, imposing stone wall that now illegally stood 3 feet inside my yard. He was selling a lie, actively using my stolen land as a key feature to enhance the value of his own property. It was a bald-faced act of deception, and the silence of my compliance only made his confidence grow. I maintained a facade of defeat. When neighbors asked about the monstrosity, I simply shrugged and muttered vague comments about ongoing disputes and lawyers involved, letting them assume I was tied up in slow, boring litigation that would take years to resolve. This placated the nosy and reinforced Mr. Finch's belief that he had successfully intimidated me into a state of passive, bureaucratic resistance. He believed he had won the war by simply being faster and more aggressive. He believed he had the time to close the sale, transfer the fraudulent property lines to an unsuspecting buyer, and wash his hands of the dispute entirely. But while he was staging his open houses, I was executing my own meticulous counterplan. My initial impulse, the aggressive, immediate legal action, had been shelved in favor of a devastating, surgical strike. My strategy hinged entirely on the closing date. The moment a buyer committed, the true value of my position skyrocketed. A buyer, or more importantly, their lender, relies on a clean, clear title. Any pending or active boundary dispute throws a massive, immediate wrench into the financing process. My goal was not simply to stop the sale. It was to use the threat of a title dispute to leverage a quick, clean, and financially satisfying resolution, forcing him to pay a steep price for his audacity. I began making discreet arrangements. First, I revisited the professional surveyor. I didn't just need the existing plat map. I needed physical, irrefutable evidence. I commissioned them to install 2 permanent, high-visibility aluminum markers along the precise legal boundary, running the entire length of the illegal wall. These markers were not subtle. They were bright orange, legally stamped, and certified. Crucially, I timed their installation to a Thursday morning when Mr. Finch was known to be at a weekly golf game. The surveyor's work was swift and efficient, leaving a perfectly straight, undeniable line of metal posts slicing through the air, 3 feet away from the stone wall, clearly designating the true boundary of my property. Next, I found a specialized contractor, an expert in rapid, small-scale demolition. I needed someone discreet, reliable, and capable of working under extreme time pressure. I explained the situation, showed them the legal documents, and had them review the plans. Their task would be the surgical removal of the 3-foot-wide section of the wall that encroached on my land. This was the most critical detail. I was not going to tear down his wall. I was going to tear down my property that he had illegally built upon. Legally, the structure on my land was technically my property that had been converted and appropriated by the neighbor, but the immediate goal was to execute a visually shocking, irreversible act of reclamation. I monitored the real estate listings incessantly. Finally, the status changed. Sale pending. The closing date was set for precisely 3 weeks out. The window for action was narrow, but defined. I knew the final title search and lender review would occur in the last week. That meant I had to execute the final definitive step of my plan just days before the closing. This was the moment of maximum leverage, the point where the cost of delay for Mr. Finch would be astronomically high, jeopardizing a 6-figure sale. I had gathered the legal evidence, secured the physical proof with the boundary markers, and lined up the operational component with the demolition crew. Now, all that remained was to wait for the perfect, calculated moment to strike. The cold calculus of vengeance was complete, and the final piece of the plan was about to fall into place. The final week leading up to Mr. Finch's scheduled closing was a masterclass in tension. Every interaction with him, every time I saw him on his property, felt like a silent duel. He was radiating confidence, the smug, self-satisfied aura of a man who believed he had outsmarted his neighbor and secured a significant financial victory by exploiting a legal gray area that he himself had created. He was busy cleaning, polishing, and staging his house for the final walkthrough, oblivious to the meticulously planned trap closing around him. The very presence of the 8-foot granite wall, standing tall and proud 3 feet into my land, seemed to give him immense satisfaction. It was his trophy, his monument to superior aggression. I received the final confirmation from my attorney. The title company handling Mr. Finch's transaction was running its final checks, coordinating with the mortgage lender, and preparing the closing documents for signing in just 2 days. This was the window. This was the point of maximum vulnerability for Mr. Finch and maximum leverage for me. If a title issue arose now, it would not just delay the closing. It would likely collapse the entire deal, forcing him to renegotiate with a skeptical buyer and potentially exposing him to litigation for failing to disclose a known property dispute. My demolition crew was placed on a precise, non-negotiable schedule. They would arrive at 6 a.m. on the day before closing, a time carefully chosen to precede Mr. Finch's usual wake-up time, but late enough to operate in clear daylight. I had secured a temporary, highly specialized permit for the removal of an encroaching structure that aligned with the official surveyor's marks. All legal paperwork was pre-signed, certified, and waiting. Everything was locked down. The night before the operation, I sat in my backyard, staring at the illegal wall. The moonlight caught the rough texture of the granite blocks, making the structure look even more imposing and permanent. For months, it had been a source of simmering rage and a constant visual symbol of violation. Now, knowing its existence was finite, there was a strange, almost meditative calm. I walked over to the bright orange survey markers that sliced through the air 3 feet from the stone. The line was immutable, dictated by decades of legal precedent and county records. The wall's arrogance had been its undoing. It had strayed too far from the legal truth. I prepared my final pieces of evidence. I had recorded the entire process, the initial staking, the foundation pour, and the final construction, with timestamps and date overlays. I had high-resolution photographs documenting the precise 3-foot gap between the official survey markers and the wall. Crucially, I prepared a neatly organized folder containing the original cease and desist letter, the certified property plat, and a detailed letter explaining the situation, addressed not to Mr. Finch, but to the buyer's title company and the mortgage lender. This letter was the ultimate poison pill. My plan was multi-pronged, designed for immediate and irreversible impact. Phase 1. The surgical demolition of the encroaching section. Phase 2. The simultaneous delivery of the title dispute evidence packet to all relevant parties: the lender, the title company, and the buyer. This 2-part strike ensured that the physical damage was instantly paired with the legally damning documentation. The physical removal of the structure on my land would serve as concrete proof of the active, unresolved property dispute, immediately clouding the title just hours before signing. Sleep was impossible. I visualized the sequence of events over and over. The roar of the machinery, the shock on Mr. Finch's face, the frantic phone calls. I was not seeking dialogue. I was executing a judgment. The time for polite requests and legal letters had passed. Tomorrow would be the day of reckoning, a decisive move that would shatter Mr. Finch's smug confidence and expose his fraudulent sale attempt. The sun would rise soon, and with it, the great wall of arrogance would begin its swift, decisive, and loud deconstruction. The silence of my compliance was about to be replaced by the deafening sound of a victory I had strategically engineered. The morning air was still cool and dense with dew, but the impending spectacle quickly dissolved any suburban stillness. At precisely 6 a.m., the quiet neighborhood was brutally awakened by the sound of heavy diesel engines rumbling into position. My demolition crew, sharp, professional, and entirely focused, wasted no time. They were not subtle. A heavy-duty skid steer loader, armed with a hydraulic breaker attachment, was maneuvered expertly onto my lawn, its tracks grinding softly against the perfectly manicured grass. They placed bright orange safety cones along the precise legal boundary marked by the surveyor's posts, the line that ran 3 feet parallel to Mr. Finch's massive granite wall. The operation was a model of cold, surgical precision. The crew chief, a man named Marcus whose face was impassive and determined, gave a quick nod. The hydraulic breaker, a massive steel tooth of destruction, engaged with a deafening thwomp. The first impact against the 8-foot granite structure, 3 feet deep inside my property, sent a shudder through the ground. Stone chips and concrete dust flew into the air as the first block fractured violently. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of metal against rock, amplified by the morning silence. It was not mere noise. It was the sound of righteous property reclamation. Within minutes, lights began flicking on in the houses lining Sycamore Lane. Curtains twitched. Neighbors, roused from their sleep, crept onto their porches, coffee mugs forgotten in their hands, their eyes wide with disbelief as they witnessed the destruction of the wall of arrogance. My crew ignored them all, working with the ruthless efficiency of a military operation. They focused only on the 3-foot-wide section that lay on my side of the bright orange boundary line. The legal definition was their only guide. They were not tearing down the entire wall. They were surgically excising the illegal encroachment, leaving the remaining portion of a structure, the part that sat legally on Mr. Finch's side of the line, utterly compromised and structurally unsound. The moment I had anticipated arrived with a bang, both literal and metaphorical. A piercing, enraged shriek erupted from 144 Sycamore. Mr. Finch, still in his silk pajamas, burst out his back door, his face a mask of apoplectic fury. He stood there, barefoot on his patio, his arms flailing wildly as he tried to comprehend the scene. The bright orange lines, the heavy machinery, and a massive, gaping wound already torn into his expensive, fraudulent wall. He tried to rush onto the work site, but Marcus, the crew chief, simply stepped in front of the orange cones, extending a powerful arm and pointing firmly at the bright metal post that clearly delineated the property line. The implication was clear. The crew was on my land, operating entirely within their legal rights, removing my property that had been built upon without consent. Simultaneously, my secondary operation was initiated. A dedicated courier, prepaid and instructed, was already delivering the crucial, certified folders. These folders, containing the surveyor's reports, the photographic evidence of the encroachment, and the documentation of the active, unresolved physical dispute, were being hand-delivered directly to the offices of the title company, the mortgage lender, and the buyer's agent. The delivery timestamp was critical, 7 a.m., exactly 1 hour into the demolition, and just hours before the closing documents were scheduled to be finalized. The physical removal of the wall was the proof. The paperwork was the legal execution. By 9 a.m., the work was finished. The 8-foot granite wall was gone from my 3-foot strip. What remained was a ridiculous, mutilated piece of masonry, a jagged, unstable, 5-foot-wide sliver of a wall, now terminating abruptly at the bright orange boundary markers. The sight was devastatingly eloquent. My property was free, demarcated by a straight, clean line of disturbed earth. Mr. Finch's property was left with a useless, ugly remnant of his grand vision, a structure now deemed a liability by any professional builder. The rubble, per the agreement, was neatly piled entirely on his remaining property, a final, physical reminder of his transgression. The legal and financial consequences of that 7 a.m. delivery, however, were just beginning to unfold, setting the stage for the true, crushing victory. The sudden, chaotic silence that fell over 142 and 144 Sycamore Lane after the demolition crew departed was heavy with implications. The wreckage of the Great Wall of Arrogance lay heaped on Mr. Finch's side of the newly exposed property line, a humiliating monument to his failed land grab. My 3-foot strip of land, though scarred by the earth-moving equipment, was legally and physically mine once more. But the true detonation had occurred not with the hydraulic breaker, but in the sterile, air-conditioned offices of the title company and the mortgage lender. By midday, the consequences began raining down on Mr. Finch. His phone became a source of constant, frantic ringing. The title company had immediately halted all proceedings. The certified documentation I had provided, proving an active, physical, and documented property dispute, was the legal equivalent of radioactive contamination to a real estate transaction. The lender refused to proceed. No bank would finance a home where a portion of the structure had just been surgically removed by the neighbor, confirming a fundamental disagreement over the property lines. The buyer, now fully informed of the hostile dispute and the fraudulent advertising of the walled backyard, understandably withdrew their offer, citing misrepresentation and demanding the return of their earnest money. Mr. Finch's quick, lucrative sale had collapsed into a pile of expensive legal liability. He tried, initially, to leverage his remaining authority, shouting threats and demanding that I pay for the vandalism of his property. But all his bluster dissolved against the granite wall of my attorney's preemptive actions. A certified letter was delivered that afternoon, referencing the original cease and desist letter he had ignored and confirming that the removed section was an illegal encroachment on my title property. The letter concluded by stating that I reserve the right to sue for trespass, property damage to my lawn by his contractors, and the cost of the surgical removal of the encroaching structure, effectively putting him on notice that he faced significant financial jeopardy. Mr. Finch was trapped. His property was now demonstrably difficult, if not impossible, to sell at the premium price he desired. The ugly, jagged remnant of the wall was a permanent visual scar, broadcasting his failure to the entire neighborhood. He was suddenly facing massive legal costs, the loss of his buyer, and the overwhelming reality that he had initiated a fight he could not win. The beautiful, quiet suburban peace he had shattered was now shattered for him too. Only his damage was self-inflicted and recorded in the county records. After 3 days of radio silence, the official communication arrived, a proposal from Mr. Finch's panicked new lawyer. It was not a fight, it was a surrender. The proposal offered a complete and unconditional concession. Mr. Finch would accept full financial responsibility for the damages. He offered to pay my entire legal consultation fee, the cost of the surveyor and the permanent boundary markers, and the full bill for the demolition and cleanup crew, effectively covering every dime I had spent in my meticulous revenge. Furthermore, he agreed, in writing, to permanently sign an official agreement acknowledging the boundary line and waiving all future claims related to the demolished structure. The final act of the reclamation was quiet and deeply satisfying. I accepted his full, humiliating surrender. The funds were wired directly into my account within 48 hours. Mr. Finch hired his own, shame-faced crew to dismantle the remaining 5-foot-wide section of the granite wall entirely, as it was now a costly liability on his own property. As the final stone blocks were loaded onto the truck, the sun streamed across my backyard, hitting the exact line of the bright orange survey markers. The property line was clean, undisputed, and permanently defined. My 3 feet of land were physically, financially, and legally restored. The great wall of arrogance was gone, leaving only the memory of a neighbor who believed entitlement trumped the law, and the definitive proof that waiting for the perfect moment of maximum leverage is the sweetest form of property line revenge.